The morning Frederick Bristol rode onto Carter land with a folded deed in his breast pocket and thunder in his eyes. He had no idea that the woman waiting for him on that porch would become the most important person he had ever known. The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory was still a place where a man's word and a woman's nerve were tested daily by sun and dust, and the unforgiving weight of consequence. The town of Harrow Creek sat between two ridges of red sandstone like something the earth had exhaled and forgotten to take back. A scattering of clapboard buildings, and a general store that smelled of leather and tobacco, and the quiet desperation of people trying to build something permanent in a land that seemed to resist permanence at every turn. The Bristol Ranch and the Carter Ranch sat on opposite sides of Clearwater Creek, and for 20 years the two families had maintained a peace that was really nothing more than a mutual willingness to stay out of each other's way. That peace ended the morning Harlan Carter was buried. Lenora Carter had not slept the night before the funeral. She sat at the kitchen table of the farmhouse her father had built with his own hands, tracing the grain of the wood with one finger while the oil lamp burned low, and the Arizona night pressed against the windows like something wanting to come inside. She was 24 years old, and she was now alone on 340 acres with 16 head of cattle, 2 horses, a barn that needed a new roof before winter, and a deed to land that every man within 20 miles of Harrow Creek seemed to suddenly believe she was incapable of holding. She had the kind of face that people looked past at first, not because it was plain, but because it was quiet. Brown hair that she wore in a braid that fell between her shoulders, dark eyes that held things in them longer than most people were comfortable with, a mouth that was more given to listening than speaking. She was not small, and she was not fragile. Her hands were the hands of a woman who had spent her whole life working beside her father, who had learned to read cattle and weather and ground before she learned to read words, who had driven a wagon alone to Harrow Creek in a dust storm at the age of 17, because her father needed medicine, and there was nobody else to go. She had loved Harlan Carter with the simple and total devotion of a daughter who knows her parent is not perfect, but admires him entirely anyway. He had been tough and fair and stubborn and kind, and he had raised her to believe that the land beneath her feet belonged to her the same as it had belonged to him, and that a piece of paper with her name on it was a sacred thing. The deed to the Carter Ranch had passed to Lenora on the day of her father's death, legal and witnessed, and filed in the county record's office in Prescott. She had read it 3 times since the lawyer had pressed it into her hands, her fingers careful around the edges of it as though it might dissolve. She knew the Bristols would come. She had known it before her father was even in the ground. Harlan Carter and Samuel Bristol had been enemies in the slow, grinding way of men who share a border and competing ambitions. Samuel Bristol had been trying to expand his range for 15 years, and the creek that ran between their properties was the only reliable water source for miles in any direction. Harlan had held the water rights. Those rights now belonged to Lenora. And Samuel Bristol, who was 60 years old and had the constitution of old leather and dried bone, was not the kind of man who was going to simply accept that a young woman alone was entitled to what he had wanted for 2 decades. She heard the horse before she saw it. A single rider coming up the road from the south, the morning sun behind him, so that for a moment he was just a silhouette against orange light and red dust. She set her coffee down and stood up from the porch step and squared her shoulders, because whatever was coming, she intended to meet it standing. Frederick Bristol was 26 years old and had spent most of those years trying to live up to a father whose approval operated like sunlight in a drought, visible sometimes, warmth possible in theory, but never quite reaching where it needed to go. He was tall with dark brown hair and the lean, hard build of a man who had worked cattle since he was old enough to climb a fence. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, which were gray and watchful and held a quality his mother had called curiosity and his father had called softness, and which Frederick had never quite decided how to categorize. He had not wanted to come here. He had told his father that plainly, standing in the main room of the Bristol house with his hat in his hands and his voice careful and even, the way he always made his voice when he was disagreeing with Samuel Bristol. Samuel had not listened. Samuel rarely did. "The girl's alone," Samuel had said. "She's got no husband, no brothers, no hired hands worth a damn. That water's been sitting on the wrong side of the creek for 20 years, Frederick. Harlan's gone now. You go up there and you make her understand that a new arrangement would benefit everyone." "What arrangement?" Frederick had asked. "She sells us the water rights. Fair price. Nobody's asking her to give anything away." "And if she says no," Samuel had looked at him with those flat blue eyes, "then you remind her of what it's like to try to run 300 acres alone without a man to rely on. The land'll make her case for you." Frederick had driven out that morning with a letter his father had drafted, and a legal argument his father's lawyer had assembled, and a deep, restless unease in his chest that he had not been able to name. He was not his father. He had never been able to make himself be his father, though he had tried often enough and in enough different ways to know the shape of the failure well. He pulled his horse to a stop at the gate of the Carter property and looked up at the porch. Lenora Carter was looking back at him with an expression that was not quite hostile and not quite welcoming. It was the expression of a woman who had prepared herself thoroughly and was now waiting to see whether her preparation would be adequate. "Miss Carter," he said, removing his hat, "I'm Frederick Bristol. I'm sorry for your loss." "I know who you are," she said, "and I know why you're here." He swung down from his horse and tied it to the post at the gate, because he had not been raised without manners regardless of the errand he was on. He walked up the path to the porch steps and stopped there, looking up at her. She had not moved from her position, and he noticed that she was holding herself very carefully, the way a person holds themselves when they are containing something. "May I come up?" he asked. She considered this for a moment. Then she moved aside and gestured toward the chairs at the far end of the porch. He sat down. She did not. She leaned against the porch rail with her arms crossed and looked at him directly, and he found himself looking back because her eyes were the kind of dark brown that had a lot going on inside them, and he had the strange sensation of being assessed more thoroughly than he usually was. "Your father send you?" she asked. "Yes." "What's the letter say?" He blinked. "How did you know about the letter?" "Because your father had a lawyer in Prescott draw up a document 2 months before my father died," she said evenly. "My father told me. He was watching for it." Frederick was quiet for a moment. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the letter and held it out to her. "You may as well read it yourself." She took it, unfolded it, and read it. He watched her face while she read and saw nothing move except for a slight tightening around her eyes when she reached the middle section. She folded it back up and handed it to him. "He wants the water rights. He wants to purchase them. At a fair price, he says. The price he's offered is not fair. It's a third of what they're worth." Frederick looked down at his hat in his hands. He had not read the letter carefully enough to know the number, and now he felt the specific kind of shame that comes from being sent on a mission you did not interrogate sufficiently before undertaking it. "I didn't write the letter," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you brought it." The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was honest, and Frederick found that he could sit in it better than he had expected. "I'm not selling the water rights," Lenora said at last. "Not at that price, and not to your father in any case. He would use them to expand north and east, and he'd buy up the Henson spread by summer, and by next year there'd be nothing between Bristol land and the county line. I've watched how your father operates, Mr. Bristol. My father watched it for 20 years. "He might," Frederick said, and the honesty of that single admission surprised them both. Lenora looked at him steadily. Something shifted slightly in her expression, not softening exactly, but something becoming more precise. "You don't want to be here," she said. "No. Then why did you come?" He looked up at her. "Because my father asked me to. That's not enough of a reason to do something wrong." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Another silence. A red-tailed hawk turned slow circles above the ridge to the east, and the cattle in the near pasture moved with their slow, deliberate calm, and the morning light came across the dry grass in long gold stripes. "You want coffee?" Lenora asked. He was startled by the question. "Yes, actually, thank you." She went inside, and he sat on the porch and looked out at her land and tried to understand what he was feeling. It was something like relief, which did not make any particular sense given that he had failed entirely at what his father had sent him to do. But there it was, sitting in his chest with the stubbornness of a fact. She came back out with 2 cups and handed him one and took up her position at the rail again. The coffee was strong and good. "3 weeks ago," she said, not looking at him but looking out at the pasture, "one of your father's hands cut the fence on the east side of my property, near the creek. My cattle could have gotten out. I fixed it myself." Frederick went very still. "I didn't know about that." "I imagine not. Things happen on a ranch the owner's son doesn't always know about." Her voice was careful, not accusatory, but laying facts out the way you lay bricks, one at a time. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "Since before my father got sick. Small things. Fence cuts, trespass, water being redirected from the secondary channel. Nothing big enough to take to a judge. Everything just inconvenient enough to make running this place harder." She turned and looked at him directly. "I'm telling you this not because I expect you to fix it. I'm telling you because I want you to know what kind of errand you've been riding." He felt the color rise along the back of his neck. "I'll speak to my father." "You do that," she said, without any particular emphasis. He drank his coffee. The morning lengthened around them. He found that he did not want to leave, which was a strange thing considering the circumstances. "You plan to run this place alone?" he asked after a while. He kept his voice neutral, curious rather than challenging. "I plan to run this place," she said. "Whether I'm alone or not is a separate question. Do you have help?" "I have Pete Garza. He's worked here for 6 years. He's good with cattle and reliable." She paused. "And I have myself." He looked at her again, really looked, and he saw the steadiness in her, the particular quality of a person who has decided on a thing and made peace with the cost of it. He had not expected to find that here. He was not sure what he had expected. "I'll go," he said, standing, setting his cup on the rail. "I'll tell my father you declined." "You can tell him more than that," Lenora said. "You can tell him that I've had a letter drafted as well, that if the fence cutting continues or the water diversion, I'll be taking the matter to the Territorial Land Commissioner in Prescott, and that I have documentation going back 18 months. Frederick stared at her. "You've been documenting it." "My father taught me to write things down, dates, times, descriptions. He kept a journal of it for 2 years before he died. I've continued it." She met his gaze. "I'm not unprepared, Mr. Bristol. I'm just alone. Those are different things." He nodded slowly. He picked up his hat from the chair and turned it in his hands. He said the thing that was most true because it was the only kind of thing he seemed able to say in her presence. "I'll make sure the fence cutting stops." She studied him for a long moment. "Why?" "Because it's wrong," he said, "and because I don't want to be the kind of man who lets it continue when he knows about it." He rode back to the Bristol ranch with the unopened deed offer still in his breast pocket, and the feeling that something important had shifted, like a stone turned over to show what lives underneath it. He found his father in the study, which was a room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old authority, with maps of the territory pinned to the wall and ledger books stacked on the desk. Samuel Bristol was a man who looked like he had been made from the land itself, broad and angular and weathered, with white hair and the kind of blue eyes that had lost all their warmth somewhere around 30 years ago and never found it again. "Well," Samuel said without looking up from his ledger. "She declined," Frederick said. He set the letter on the desk. "She's not selling." Samuel looked up then. "Did you explain the terms?" "She understood the terms. She disagreed with them." Frederick sat down in the chair across from his father. "She also knows about the fence cutting." Silence. "I told her it would stop," Frederick said, "and I need you to make sure it does, because she has documentation going back 18 months and she'll take it to the land commissioner." Samuel Bristol put down his pen very slowly. He looked at his son with the expression he had always used when Frederick disappointed him, which was not quite anger and not quite contempt, but something that lived in the territory between them. "You went to put pressure on a girl alone on her property, and you came back telling me what will and won't be done on my own ranch." "I came back telling you what she said," Frederick replied, "and what I agreed to. I'm sorry if that wasn't what you wanted, but I'm not going to be party to what amounts to harassment of a woman who just buried her father and is trying to hold on to what's legally hers." He stood up. "I'll take the north pasture fence check this afternoon. I'll see if anything else needs mending on the east boundary." He walked out before his father could respond. He did not sleep well that night either. In the weeks that followed, Frederick found reasons to ride near the Carter property. He told himself it was because he needed to verify the fence line was intact, which was true and also not the whole truth. He saw her twice at a distance, once working with Pete Garza moving cattle between pastures, and once alone by the creek, crouching at the water's edge doing something he couldn't quite see. Both times he rode on without stopping, because stopping without a reason felt presumptuous, and he was trying to be careful about the kind of man he was becoming. The third time he saw her, she saw him too. He was checking the east boundary fence, riding along it slowly, and she was on the other side of the creek with a bucket, and she straightened up and looked at him across the water without any particular expression. He stopped his horse. He took off his hat. "Miss Carter, Mr. Bristol." She looked at the fence line behind him. "Thank you. The cuts have stopped. I told you they would. A lot of men tell me things," she said. "You're among the smaller number who follow through." He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and she went back to whatever she was doing with the bucket, and he continued along the fence line, and the creek ran between them with its low, clear sound, and he thought about her for the rest of the afternoon in a way that felt new and somewhat alarming. The harvest social in Harrow Creek came the second week of October, as it did every year, in the open area behind the general store. Tables were set up and someone brought a fiddle and someone else brought a squeeze box, and the town tried briefly to believe in its own optimism. Lenora went because her father had always gone, and because she needed flour and lamp oil from the store, and because she was not, she told herself firmly, going to begin hiding from the town, just because some of its residents were watching her with that particular brand of speculative pity that she found harder to endure than open hostility. She wore her good dress, which was a dark blue wool that she had made herself the winter before and which fit well through the shoulders because she had measured it 3 times and she did not do things halfway. She put her hair up. She carried herself the way her father had taught her, head up, shoulders back, which he had always said was not about arrogance but about clarity. She was at the general store counter waiting for her flour to be measured out when she heard the door open behind her and turned and found Frederick Bristol standing in it. He looked surprised to see her, and then he didn't look surprised, and then he took off his hat and nodded. "Miss Carter, Mr. Bristol." He came to the counter and stood a little way from her, waiting for Mr. Halpern to finish with her order. She was aware of him in the specific way you become aware of someone you have been thinking about without meaning to, a heightened quality to the air around them, a sharpness. "Are you here for the social?" he asked. "Among other things, you." "My mother wanted to come. She doesn't get to town much." He paused. "She's been asking after you, actually. She was sorry to hear about your father." Lenora looked at him. "Your mother and my father used to talk at church before your father stopped attending." She said this without barbs, just as information. "I know," he said. "She misses those conversations." Mr. Halpern set her packages on the counter and quoted a price, and she paid it and started gathering her things, and Frederick stepped forward without being asked and lifted the heavier sack. "I can carry that," she said. "I know you can," he said. "I'm offering to anyway." She looked at him for a moment and then let him carry it. Outside, the social was warming up. The fiddle was going, and the air smelled of wood smoke and roasting corn, and the turned-earth smell of October, and people were gathered in clumps of conversation, while a few younger couples made tentative attempts at dancing. Lenora set her packages in her wagon and Frederick set the sack down beside them, and they both stood for a moment in the lamplight that spilled out from the store front. "Will you dance?" he said. It came out so plainly that she thought she had misheard him. "I beg your pardon. Will you dance?" he repeated. He looked slightly mortified, as though the words had surprised him as much as they had surprised her. "I realize we're in a somewhat unusual position to be asking each other to dance, given the circumstances between our families. But I've been thinking about you," he said, and stopped and started again. "I've been thinking about our conversation on your porch. And I thought that if you were willing, I'd like to talk more. Dancing seems like a reasonable occasion for it." She regarded him in the lamplight. He had the look of a man who has just done something he can't take back and is trying to decide whether he regrets it. "All right," she said. They danced to two tunes from the fiddle player, a fast one and then a slower one, and she noticed that he danced with his whole attention, not looking around the crowd the way some men did, but keeping his focus on what was immediately in front of him, which was her. "Tell me something," she said during the slower one. "Do you actually want your father's ranch?" "All of it, the expansion, the water rights, all of it." He was quiet for a moment. "I want a ranch," he said. "I'm not sure I want my father's version of one." "What's the difference?" "His version requires owning everything," Frederick said. "Mine just requires enough." She looked up at him, and the space between them felt different suddenly, charged with something that had nothing to do with the music. "I think you're better than your father," she said. "And I think you know it, and I think it costs you." He held her gaze. "I think you're the most direct person I've ever met." "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It's the opposite of a problem." They danced the second tune through to the end, and then stood together at the edge of the gathering, and talked for another hour, about land and cattle and the creek, and what the winter looked like based on the thickness of the grass and the behavior of the elk herds, and also about books, because it turned out that Frederick Bristol had read more books than most people in Harrow Creek expected from a rancher's son, and Lenora Carter had opinions about all of them. His mother found them eventually. Margaret Bristol was a woman in her 50s with soft gray hair, and the kind of warmth that seemed to have survived years of being married to Samuel Bristol through sheer determined retention. She took both of Lenora's hands in hers when they were introduced and held them for a moment. "Your father was a good man," Margaret said simply. "I'm sorry." "Thank you," Lenora said. "He thought well of you too." Margaret looked between her son and Lenora with an expression that was carefully neutral, but held a quality of cautious hope that Frederick recognized, and which made him look away briefly. He rode home that night under a sky full of October stars, and felt something moving in his chest that he had not felt before, or had not felt like this. A specific warmth and a specific longing that centered entirely on a woman with dark eyes and a braid, and the kind of steadiness that made everything around her seem more solid. He was in considerable trouble, and he was beginning to understand it. November came in dry and cold, and Lenora had the barn roof to deal with. She had been pricing timber in Harrow Creek and doing the arithmetic in her margins, and the conclusion she kept arriving at was uncomfortable. She had money from the sale of a portion of the summer's cattle, but the roof would take almost all of it, and if winter was hard, she would need to keep a reserve for feed. Pete Garza helped where he could, but he was one man and there were limits, and the barn roof was a job that wanted at least two people working together over several days. She was on the roof herself on a cold Tuesday morning, checking which boards had gone soft and marking them with chalk, when she heard a horse come up the road. She looked over the edge of the roof and saw Frederick Bristol at her gate. He was not alone. There were two men with him, young ranch hands she didn't recognize, and a wagon loaded with timber. She climbed down the ladder carefully and stood in the yard and looked at him. He had dismounted and was standing by his horse with his hat in his hand. "My foreman cut timber last week for the spring work," he said. "He cut more than we needed. I thought it might be useful here." She looked at the wagon. It was a very specific amount of timber. It was, she estimated with a glance, almost exactly what her barn roof required. "This wasn't extra timber," she said. "No," he admitted. It wasn't. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the two ranch hands, who were looking carefully at the middle distance in the way of men who have been instructed not to become part of whatever conversation is happening. "Your father know you're here?" she asked. "No." "What would he say if he did?" Frederick considered the question. "Nothing I haven't heard before." She looked at the timber again. She thought about the roof and the winter and the arithmetic that hadn't come out right. She thought about the particular pride that had kept her going since her father died, the refusal to appear weakened, the determination to manage. She thought about the fact that this man had cut timber and loaded a wagon and driven it to her property on a cold November morning with no audience and no credit. "You and your men want breakfast before you start?" she asked. Frederick looked up at her. Something moved in his expression, a warmth, a relief. A quality she was beginning to learn was what he looked like when he was genuinely pleased. "Yes," he said, "we would." She made biscuits and salt pork and strong coffee, and the two ranch hands, whose names were Cal and Domingo, ate with the focused efficiency of men who had been working since before sunrise. Frederick ate and talked with her about the weather coming in from the north and the state of the creek, and how the winter pasture grass looked on his side of the boundary. And it was the most natural conversation she had had with anyone since her father died, she realized. The most natural conversation she had had with someone who was not Pete Garza, which was saying something, because Pete Garza was the best kind of quiet company. They worked on the roof for 3 days. The first day it was Frederick and Cal and Domingo, and Lenora worked alongside them because she was not a woman who stood in the yard and watched men work on her property. Frederick did not suggest she stop. He simply worked beside her and handed her things when she needed them, and held the boards while she nailed and trusted her to know what she was doing. By the end of the first day, she was working with him in the easy rhythm of two people who have figured out each other's pace, and she noticed that he was watching her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. By the end of the second day, the roof was half done, and she had caught herself watching him in return. Cal and Domingo rode back to the Bristol ranch after the second day, their work complete as far as they were concerned. Frederick came back on the third day alone. She heard his horse early in the morning and went out to find him already setting up the ladder. "You didn't have to come back," she said from the doorway. "I know," he said. "We've got about 4 boards left. Seems wasteful to leave them undone." She brought him coffee and they stood in the early cold and looked at the barn together. The new boards were pale against the weathered wood around them, solid and true. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "What do you want? Not just for the ranch, for yourself." Nobody had asked her that, not in those words, not with that directness. She stood with it for a moment. "I want to keep this land," she said, "and I want to know that I kept it myself. Not because I sold it or sold some piece of it or let someone else carry it for me." She paused. "And I want not to be alone," she said, and then looked faintly startled by her own honesty. He was looking at her. The morning light was the pale gold of November, thin and clear, and it caught the silver in his watchband and the gray of his eyes. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about what this looks like from the outside. What does it look like? Like Bristol's son doing charity for the woman his father wants to pressure into selling." He looked at her directly. "That's not what this is." "I know," she said. "You know. You're not capable of that kind of calculation," she said. "I could see it the first day you came here. You're a straightforward person pretending to operate in a complicated situation." He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the first she had heard from him, and it changed his whole face. "My father would argue with you about the straightforward part." "Your father mistakes stubbornness for complexity," she said. "They're different things." He laughed again, and she smiled, and they stood in the November cold with coffee going warm between their hands, and something growing between them that neither of them was naming yet, but both of them could feel. They finished the roof that morning. Frederick stayed for the midday meal and then for the afternoon, because Lenora had a section of east fence that needed attention, and he had noticed it on his way in and mentioned it. And one thing led naturally to another. Pete Garza worked nearby, wisely and quietly minding his own affairs. In the late afternoon, they sat on the porch steps because the work was done, and neither of them was quite ready to end the day. The shadows were long across the dry grass, and the air had that sharp, cold smell of winter coming. "Frederick," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it. "Lenora," he said with the same weight, and she looked at him. "I need to tell you that I am not going to let this ranch go," she said. "Whatever happens, whoever comes to challenge that deed, I'm going to hold this land. It was my father's and it's mine, and it will be mine until I decide otherwise. I want you to understand that about me." "I understand it," he said. "I wouldn't want it any other way." She studied his face. "Why not?" "Because a woman who'd fold the first time someone pushed isn't the woman who'd be worth knowing," he said simply. She was quiet for a long moment. The sun was going down behind the western ridge, and the sky was going orange and red and the kind of deep purple that only happened in Arizona in the November evenings, extravagant and brief. "Your father is going to cause trouble," she said. "Yes. For both of us if you keep coming here." "Yes," he said again. "Does that bother you?" He turned to look at her fully, and his expression was open and certain in a way she had not seen it before. "No," he said. "Lenora, it doesn't bother me at all." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she nodded once, the small, definitive nod of a person who has made a decision. "Then you can come for supper Thursday," she said. "If you want to." "I want to," he said. He rode back to the Bristol ranch in the last of the evening light with a feeling in his chest that he could only describe as brightness, as though something that had been running low had been replenished, and he carried it all the way home and to bed and woke with it still there in the morning. Samuel Bristol confronted him at breakfast. Someone in town had seen Frederick at the Carter property. Someone always saw something in Harrow Creek, because the town was small enough that privacy was mostly aspirational. Samuel set down his fork and looked at his son across the table and said, "You've been spending time with Harlan Carter's girl." "Her name is Lenora," Frederick said. "And yes." "What are you doing?" "Having a conversation, helping with a barn roof." He kept his voice level. "Being a decent neighbor. Being a decent neighbor." Samuel repeated this with the particular flatness that meant he found it absurd. "Frederick, that woman is sitting on land and water rights that this ranch needs. You going over there and making friends with her is not helpful." "I disagree," Frederick said. "I don't care whether you, father." Frederick set down his own fork carefully. He looked at his father straight on. "I'm going to say something, and I need you to hear it. What you've been doing to that property, the fence cuts, the water diversion, the pressure, all of it ends now. Completely and permanently." His voice was quiet and absolutely even. "Not because she threatened to go to the commissioner, though she will and she has grounds to, but because it's wrong. It has always been wrong, and you know it and I know it." Samuel was very still. "I'm not going to keep being part of something I know is wrong," Frederick said. "I'll work this ranch. I'll work it hard. But I won't be the instrument of something that ought to embarrass both of us." The silence at the breakfast table was the specific heavy kind that contains years. Finally Samuel said, "You've got feelings for the girl." "That's separate," Frederick said. "My objection to what we've been doing is not contingent on my personal feelings about anyone." "But you do," Samuel said, and his voice held something unexpected, something almost like resignation. "Yes," Frederick said, "I do." Samuel Bristol was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the land he had spent his whole life building. He was 60 years old, and he had a ranch worth considerable money, and he had 2 sons. And Frederick was the one who had always been harder for him to understand and easier for him to respect, though he had never said that second thing aloud. "Don't make a fool of yourself," Samuel said finally, and picked up his fork again, and that was all. It was not a blessing, but it was not a prohibition either, and Frederick decided to take it as the closest thing to acceptance his father was currently capable of giving. He went to supper Thursday, and Friday, and the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. Lenora made food that was simple and good, beef stew and cornbread and dried apple preserves. And they talked over every meal with the easy thoroughness of people who have discovered that they are interested in everything the other person has to say. She told him about growing up on the ranch, about learning to read cattle signs from her father, about the summer she was 12 when the creek had run dry for 6 weeks, and they had carried water by hand to keep the animals alive, about her mother who had died when Lenora was 9 from a fever that had come through the valley and taken 3 people that season. He told her about the year he had gone to school in Prescott at his mother's insistence, about the books he had read there that had opened the world up in ways he was still working through, about the particular loneliness of being the son of a man whose ambitions left little room for anyone else's nature. They talked about justice, because it was everywhere in the Arizona Territory of 1878, the question of who the land belonged to and what that meant. They talked about the Apache people who had lived in these canyons for generations before anyone else arrived, and what it meant that this land they both loved and claimed had been taken by force and by policy from people who had no say in it. Lenora held these thoughts with a seriousness that Frederick admired, because it would have been easier to simply not think about them, and easier still to decide that the history of a place was separate from the present obligation to it. "My father doesn't think about it at all," Frederick said one evening. They were sitting by the fireplace because it was December now and the nights were cold. "He thinks the land is his because he worked it and because the law says so, and that's the end of the story." "And you?" she asked. "I think the law being on your side doesn't automatically mean you're right," he said, "which is a complicated thought when you're trying to justify your right to be here at all." "We are here," she said quietly. "That's a fact that can't be undone. But what we do with where we are, that's the part we still get to decide." He looked at her in the firelight, and she was so entirely herself, so entirely present and honest and real, and he was struck again by the same sensation he had been having with increasing frequency, that she was the most alive person he had ever been in a room with. "Lenora," he said. She looked at him. "I need to tell you," he said, "that what I feel when I'm here with you is not something I've felt before. Not like this." He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at her seriously. "And I don't want to be careless with it, or with you. You've got enough on your shoulders without me adding to it. But I also don't want to be dishonest about it because I think you've got the right to know." She was very still, watching him. "I think I'm in love with you," he said. "I think it's been coming since the morning I rode up to your porch and you were standing there like you'd been expecting exactly this and had decided exactly how to handle it. I've been in considerable trouble since then, if I'm honest." The fire popped. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass with a soft sound. "Frederick," she said slowly, as though trying out the weight of what she was about to say, "I have been telling myself for 2 months that this was a practical matter. That you were the neighbor's son and you had been helpful, and that it was sensible to be on good terms with you." She looked at him steadily. "I stopped being able to tell myself that somewhere around the 2nd week of November." He reached across the space between them and took her hand very carefully and held it. Her hand was calloused and strong and warm, and she let him hold it, looking at him with those dark eyes that held everything in them. "I'm not easy," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not going to change what I am or what I want for the ranch or how I run things because someone wants me to. Not even someone I care about." "I know," he said. "I don't want you to change anything. I'm not interested in a different version of you. I'm interested in exactly this one." She looked at their joined hands for a long moment. Then she turned her hand and held his back. "All right," she said softly. "All right then." He stayed until late, and when he rode home under the December stars, he was so full of something warm and full and real that it felt almost like a physical weight, like something he could carry with both hands and would never want to set down. The trouble his father had promised came in January, and it came in the form of a legal filing. Samuel Bristol's lawyer filed a claim with the Territorial Land Office in Prescott, arguing that portions of the Carter property had been surveyed incorrectly when the original deed was issued, and that the eastern boundary as registered was in error, and that a resurvey would likely show Bristol land extending further west than the current documents indicated. It was not, on its face, a frivolous claim. Survey errors were common in the territory, and they were an established tool for people who wanted to create legal ambiguity around a property line and then apply pressure inside that ambiguity. Lenora got the notice on a Thursday morning. She read it twice, standing by her mailbox, and then folded it carefully and walked back to the house and sat at the kitchen table and read it twice more. Then she got up and saddled her horse and rode to Harrow Creek to find the lawyer named Thomas Birch, who had an office above the saddle shop and who she knew had handled her father's legal affairs for 15 years. Thomas Birch read the filing with his spectacles on his nose and his mouth a thin line. He was 63 years old and had the particular quality of a man who had seen most things go wrong at least once. "They've got a weak argument," he said. "The original survey was done by a reputable firm in 1861. The boundaries are clean and consistent, but this will tie up the property in a legal process for potentially 6 to 8 months, and during that time there could be restrictions on your use of the eastern pasture. How do I fight it? Counterfiling, documentation of the original survey, and testimony from anyone who can speak to the consistent history of the boundary." He set the papers down. "It will cost money, Lenora. Not a catastrophic amount, but more than is comfortable on a working ranch budget." She looked at the document on his desk. "File the counter," she said. "I have my father's journals. I have the original survey certificate. I'll get testimony from Pete Garza and anyone else who's worked this land." "Good," he said. "Come back Monday with everything you have." She rode back to the ranch and sat with it through the afternoon, working it over in her head the way she worked through any practical problem, looking at it from all sides, calculating what she had and what she needed. Frederick arrived just before sundown. He had ridden fast, which she could see from the state of his horse, and he had a look on his face she had not seen before, a tight-jawed, deliberate anger that he was working to keep controlled. "I just heard," he said, dismounting. "I'm sorry. I didn't know he was going to do this." "I know you didn't," she said. "I want to help. With the counterfiling, I can testify to the boundary. I've ridden that fence line enough times to speak to it in any court in the territory." She looked at him steadily. "You'd testify against your own father." "I'd testify to what's true," he said, "which happens to be against my father's claim, yes." "Frederick, that is a very significant thing." "Yes," he said, "it is." He looked at her with that direct, certain look that she had come to understand was his version of making a declaration. "I told you I wasn't going to be part of something wrong. This is wrong. I'm not going to stand aside from that because it's my father doing it." She crossed the yard to where he was standing and looked up at him. "Your father will make this very hard for you." "My father and I have been arriving at this moment for about 26 years, Frederick said. "I'd rather it happen over something that matters." She reached up and touched his face just briefly, and the expression that moved across his features at that was something she wanted to hold on to. "All right," she said. "Then come inside and help me go through my father's journals. We need to pull every entry that references the eastern boundary." They worked at the kitchen table for 4 hours, Frederick and Lenora and Pete Garza, who turned out to have a sharper memory than any of them for specific dates and specific incidents. And by 10 o'clock at night, they had assembled a documentation package that Thomas Birch, when he saw it Monday morning, declared to be one of the most thorough he had encountered in 30 years of territorial law practice. The legal process took 4 months. During those 4 months, something happened between Frederick Bristol and Lenora Carter that was both gradual and inevitable, like the turning of a season, like the creek rising in spring. It was made of small things. The mornings he arrived early enough to have coffee ready when she came out of the barn. The evenings they sat on the porch past dark because neither of them wanted to stop talking. The afternoon the early spring storm came in faster than expected, and they worked side by side through the rain to get the cattle into shelter, arriving afterward at the barn door soaked through, and laughing in a way that surprised them both. It was made of the things they told each other that they had not told anyone else. Frederick talking about the years he had spent trying to make himself into the version of a son that his father needed, and the specific grief of understanding that he never would be. Lenora talking about the night her father died, sitting with him through the last hours, his hand in hers, the way the silence had felt both empty and full, and how she had walked out into the yard afterward and looked at the sky and felt the weight of the land under her feet and thought, "This is mine now, and I will not let it go." Frederick kissed her for the first time in early March. They were by the creek, checking the water level after a week of warmer weather, and she was pointing out something on the far bank about the way the water was behaving differently than it had in previous years, and he turned to say something in response, and found her face very close to his and her dark eyes already looking at him. And the moment extended itself in that particular way that moments do when something important is about to happen and both people in it know it. He kissed her gently, carefully, the way he did everything when it mattered. And she kissed him back, one hand against his chest, and the creek ran past them with its clear cold sound, and the spring sky was enormous and blue above them. When they separated, she looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite something more serious but contained both. "I've been waiting for you to do that," she said. "How long?" She considered the question with apparent seriousness. "Since about the second dance at the harvest social." He laughed and she laughed with him, and the sound of it carried out over the water, and Pete Garza, who was prudently fixing fence at the far end of the east pasture, heard it and allowed himself a small private smile. The legal ruling came down in April. The Territorial Land Commissioner found in favor of Lenora Carter. The original survey was upheld, the eastern boundary confirmed, the Bristol counterclaim dismissed. Thomas Birch sent a rider to the ranch with the document, and Lenora read it standing in the yard and then sat down on the porch steps and felt something release in her chest that she had been holding tightly for 4 months. When Frederick arrived that evening, she handed him the document without a word, and he read it and then looked at her. "It's over," he said. "It's over," she agreed. He sat down beside her on the porch steps and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, which was something she had discovered she could do without giving up any of the independence she had fought for. That leaning on someone who deserved it was not the same as needing to be held up. The harder conversation happened the following week. Samuel Bristol rode to the Carter property himself. She did not know he was coming. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horse, and she looked out the window and saw the old man on his big gray horse at the gate, and she set down what she was holding and went out to meet him. Samuel Bristol dismounted slowly. He was showing his age in a way she had not seen before, or perhaps she was looking at him differently now. He took off his hat, which surprised her. "Miss Carter," he said. "Lenora," he looked at the hat in his hands. "The ruling was fair. I know it was fair. I knew it was a weak argument when my lawyer put it forward, and I let him file it anyway, and that was wrong of me." He looked up at her. "I don't have a long history of admitting that things are wrong. But I'm 60 years old, and I'd like to have a few more years of running this county without being the villain in every story told about me." Lenora looked at him for a long moment. "Your son is in love with me," she said simply. "I think you know that." Samuel met her eyes. "Yes, and I'm in love with him," she said. "I think you should know that too." Samuel Bristol nodded very slowly. The silence between them had a different quality than she had expected. "My wife," he said, "has been telling me for 3 months that Frederick found himself a woman worth finding." He paused. "Margaret is generally right about people." "I've noticed," Lenora said. He put his hat back on. He looked out at her pastures, at the cattle, at the barn with its new pale boards bright against the old ones. He looked at all of it. "I'd like to discuss a proper water-sharing arrangement," he said. "A legal one, fair to both properties. If you're willing to consider it." She held his gaze. "I'm willing to consider it," she said carefully, "with Thomas Birch present and terms in writing." "Agreed," he said. He climbed back on his horse with the stiffness of a man whose joints had put in too many years on hard ground. He looked down at her from the saddle. "My son's a better man than I am," he said. "He didn't get it from me, so I won't take credit for it. But I don't intend to stand in the way of him being what he is." He turned his horse. "Good day, Miss Carter." She stood in the yard and watched him ride away and felt something complex and necessary settle in her. The particular feeling of a fight that is over and a peace that is real. May arrived with a softness that seemed like a concession after the hard months before it. The grass came up green along the creek, and the cattle moved through it with their calm, large-bodied ease, and the morning air smelled of sage and something flowering that Lenora had never identified by name but knew by feeling. Frederick came to the ranch on a Saturday morning in mid-May. With a look on his face she had learned to associate with something significant about to be said. He was wearing his good shirt, which she noticed, and he had taken trouble with his hair, which she also noticed and which made her want to smile. He found her in the barn checking on one of the mares who had foaled 2 weeks prior. The foal was doing well, a sturdy bay colt with the good-natured curiosity of a young horse who has decided the world is probably fine. Frederick came and stood in the stall door and watched her work with the foal for a moment. "You're good with them," he said. "I've been doing this since I was 5, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about the future." "What about it?" "About what I want it to look like." He looked at the foal, then at her. "I want it to look like this, like here, like you." He came into the stall and stood near her, close enough that she could see the earnestness in his face, the particular openness that appeared when he was being most himself. "I know this isn't how it's usually done. I know I should probably be more formal about it and speak to someone, but there's no one to speak to who represents you better than you, and you wouldn't have it any other way, so I'm just going to ask you." She had gone very still. "Lenora Carter," he said, "will you marry me? Not so I can take anything from you or change anything about how this place runs or make any claims on it that aren't yours to give, but because I want to build something with you. Because I want to come home to you and talk to you and work beside you and know that the life we're making is one we both chose." He paused. "Because I love you. Because I have been in love with you since the morning I came here to do something wrong and you stood on your porch and stopped me from it." The foal bumped gently against Lenora's hand, seeking attention, and she smoothed its neck absently without looking away from Frederick. "You walked onto this property trying to take something from me," she said slowly. "Yes, and now you're asking to give something to me instead." "I'm asking to share," he said, "which is different." She looked at him for a long, serious moment. She thought about her father. She thought about the land under her feet and the deed with her name on it, and the winter she had gotten through alone and the spring she had gotten through with him beside her, and about the fact that love, real love, the kind that doesn't ask you to be less than you are, was not something you turned away from out of pride or caution when it was standing in front of you in a barn in May looking at you like you were the thing it had been looking for. "Yes," she said. "Frederick Bristol, yes." He took her face in his hands and kissed her, and the foal knocked against them both with cheerful irreverence, and she laughed against his mouth, and he laughed too, and they stood together in the warm barn in the spring morning and held on to each other with the particular steadiness of two people who have arrived somewhere they intend to stay. They were married in September of 1879 in the small church in Harrow Creek, on a morning that was clear and golden with the particular light that came to Arizona in early autumn, warm without harshness, the sky the blue of something that has decided to be beautiful. Lenora wore a dress of ivory linen that Margaret Bristol had helped her make, because Margaret Bristol had turned out to be a woman of considerable practical skill and considerable warmth, when she was not required to operate within her husband's restrictions, and she had appeared at the Carter Ranch with fabric and patterns and opinions in the 3rd week of August, and the two of them had worked on it together over 3 long afternoons with tea and conversation that covered, among other things, what to expect from Frederick in various situations, what Samuel was like when he was afraid as opposed to when he was angry, different things. Margaret said, though he confused them himself, and the specific satisfaction of having made something with your own hands that you intended to use for the rest of your life. The church was full. More of the town came than Lenora had expected, and she understood after a moment that this was not simply goodwill toward Frederick Bristol, but something more specific, a recognition of what she had done in holding her ground through the legal challenge, a quiet acknowledgement that she had earned what she stood in. Samuel Bristol sat in the front row beside his wife. He did not look comfortable, but he was there, and when Frederick turned to watch Lenora walk down the aisle, Samuel Bristol watched her too, and something moved briefly in his old face that was not quite approval but was not far from it. Thomas Birch gave Lenora away because she had asked him to, reasoning that he had defended her rights with more consistent dedication than most men she had ever known, and that being given away was something she could choose to do or not do, and that if she was going to do it, it might as well be someone she actually valued. Thomas Birch wept quietly behind his spectacles, which surprised everyone including himself. Frederick held her hands at the altar and said his vows in a voice that was steady and clear and meant every word, the way he said all the things he meant, without decoration and without reservation. She said hers looking straight at him, and the preacher pronounced them married, and the church felt like it held something alive and true. The reception was at the Carter Ranch, and it lasted most of the afternoon and into the evening, with tables set up in the yard and the fiddle player from the harvest social and food brought by half the people in Harrow Creek. Pete Garza danced with Margaret Bristol, who was an excellent dancer, and Thomas Birch drank a moderate amount of rye whiskey and told several stories about Harlan Carter that made Lenora laugh and cry in equal measure. Cal and Domingo and the other Bristol Ranch hands sat at a table with several of Harrow Creek's younger residents and contributed to the volume of the evening in ways that were spirited but not disruptive. Samuel Bristol left before the dancing started because he was who he was, but before he left he found Frederick and shook his hand for a long time, and then he found Lenora and looked at her directly and said, "Harlan Carter was a hard man to like but a man worth respecting. I hope I don't give you cause to say the same of me." It was the most he could manage, and they both knew it, and Lenora told him that she hoped so too, which was as honest as she was willing to be on her wedding day, and they left it there. Frederick and Lenora danced until the stars were out, and when the last guests had gone and the yard was quiet and the October air had the cold edge of a promise, they stood together on the porch of the house that had been her father's and was now theirs, looking out at the land in the dark. "Still yours," he said quietly. "Ours," she said. "Ours, Frederick." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood there in the dark and the quiet, and the land around them was still and large and entirely real. The years that came after were not without difficulty, because no honest life is, but they were full in the way that matters, dense with living and with substance. The winter of 1879 was hard, as winters in the Arizona Territory often were, and they worked through it together, she and Frederick and Pete Garza, learning the specific choreography of three people managing a ranch in cold and wind with water that froze at the troughs in the night, and cattle that needed watching and feed that had to be rationed carefully. Frederick was a natural rancher in the way of a person who has done it all their life, but is now doing it with intention rather than obligation, and he brought to the Carter land an energy and a knowledge that expanded what was possible without replacing what was already there. She did not change how the ranch ran. He did not ask her to. They made decisions together at the kitchen table in the evenings with maps and ledgers, and the particular focused practicality of two people who understand that love is also a project, that it requires maintenance and attention, and the willingness to say what you think even when what you think complicates things. They argued sometimes, because they were both people with strong views and the confidence to hold them, and the arguments were real and occasionally loud and always resolved, because they had both understood from the beginning that resolution was not optional, that you did not leave things open between people you intended to stay with. Their son was born in October of 1880, a month after their first anniversary, a healthy and opinionated boy who arrived in the morning and announced himself immediately and loudly, and showed every indication of continuing to do so. They named him Harlan Frederick Bristol, Harlan for her father and Frederick for his own, and Lenora held him in the lamplight of the bedroom and looked at this person, who was entirely new and also somehow deeply familiar, and felt something that did not have a name she knew, but that she recognized as the specific expansion of a heart-making room. Frederick sat beside them on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression of pure, uncomplicated awe that she had not seen on his face before, and she loved him more in that moment than she had thought possible, which was saying something considerable given how much she had already loved him. Young Harlan grew with the purposeful energy of a child who has been born onto working land and absorbs it through his feet. He was walking by 10 months and climbing things that worried both his parents by 14, and by the time he was 2 years old, he was following his mother through the cattle pastures with a seriousness that made Pete Garza shake his head in affectionate wonder. He had Frederick's gray eyes and Lenora's brown hair, and a disposition that was a direct synthesis of both of them, stubborn and curious and fundamentally decent. Samuel Bristol came to the ranch more than anyone had anticipated. He came first on the pretense of discussing the water-sharing arrangement, which had been formalized legally in the summer of 1879 and was working well for both properties. He came then to see the baby, because Margaret had insisted and because it gradually became clear Samuel found excuses to do things he wanted to do without being able to simply say that he wanted to do them. He sat with young Harlan on his knee with an expression of surprised tenderness that Frederick saw and did not comment on, because some things are better received if they are not directly acknowledged. Margaret Bristol came as often as she could manage, which was more often after Samuel got the sense to give her a horse of her own that she could take when she pleased. She and Lenora developed a friendship that had its own character entirely separate from either of their relationships with the men in their lives, a friendship of two women who were both intelligent and practical and slightly underestimated by the world around them, who found in each other's company the particular relief of being understood. A daughter came in the spring of 1882. They named her Ruth after no one in particular and everyone in general, because they liked the name for its own sake, and Lenora had strong opinions about names that should not be chosen merely as tributes when they did not fit. Ruth Bristol arrived in March with the spring grass and proved to be a different kind of person than her brother almost immediately, quieter in her expressions of displeasure, but considerably more strategic in her pursuit of what she wanted, with an early tendency to simply work at things with persistent calm until they resolved in her favor. Frederick saw his mother in her. Lenora saw no one but herself. The water-sharing arrangement with the Bristol Ranch proved to be genuinely beneficial to both properties, which was the outcome that Lenora had always known was possible if anyone approached the matter without hostility and without zero-sum thinking. The creek fed both operations through a structured allocation that Thomas Birch had helped draft, and in the dry summer of 1881, when the secondary streams had run to nothing, having a legal framework in place had prevented what would otherwise have been a destructive conflict, and instead resulted in a cooperation that got both herds through the dry months with minimal losses. Frederick hired 2 additional hands by 1882, young men from Harrow Creek named Elias and Tom, who worked the expanded operation with reliability and good character. Pete Garza, who had been Lenora's steady right hand through everything, was made ranch foreman with a wage increase and a ceremony at supper that consisted of Lenora putting a formal letter of appointment in his hand and Pete Garza looking at it for a long moment, and then saying that he supposed that was all right, which was Pete Garza's version of being moved to tears. The Carter Ranch, which was now also the Bristol Ranch, or perhaps more accurately, the Bristol-Carter operation that everyone in Harrow Creek eventually just called the Creek Ranch, grew through the early 1880s into something that was genuinely impressive. A working cattle and horse operation of close to 500 acres, when the Bristol Range was eventually incorporated through a legal consolidation that Frederick had proposed, and Lenora had reviewed carefully, and agreed to on specific terms that she had written out herself, and that both Samuel's lawyer and Thomas Birch had called one of the more thorough agreements they had reviewed. Samuel Bristol declined in health in the fall of 1883, the specific decline of an old man whose body has decided it has done enough. He lived through that winter with a stubbornness that was entirely characteristic, and in the spring of 1884 he called his sons to the house. Frederick's younger brother, James, who managed the Bristol operation from the main ranch house, came from the North Range. Margaret sat beside Samuel and held his hand without ceremony. Samuel looked at Frederick for a long time without speaking, and then he said, "I was wrong to start what I started with Harlan Carter. I want you to know I know it." It was the kind of statement that arrives very late and also exactly when it was needed, and Frederick said, "I know, Father," and meant it, because he had known it, and the fact that Samuel had gotten there himself was worth something. Samuel Bristol died in the spring of 1884, 66 years old, in the house he had built, with his wife beside him, having made his peace imperfectly and genuinely with the son who had shown him what imperfect peace looked like. Margaret Bristol moved to the Creek Ranch. This was Lenora's idea, proposed to Frederick one evening with the same directness she applied to everything practical. Margaret had her own room, her own hours, her own habits, and she contributed to the life of the house in the way of a person who has spent years being quietly capable and has finally been given full permission to be so. She taught Ruth to sew and taught Harlan to bake bread, both of which they were later grateful for. She sat on the porch with Lenora in the evenings and they talked or did not talk, and both were equally comfortable. Frederick took full management of the combined operation. He was good at it, not in his father's totalizing way but in his own way, attentive and fair and willing to hear what other people knew before he made decisions. He and Lenora ran the ranch as they ran everything together, her knowledge of cattle and land and water as essential as his management of finances and external business, neither of them the whole picture, both of them necessary. A third child arrived in 1885. They named him William, and he was small and fierce and exactly himself from the beginning, a child who approached the world with a kind of philosophical equanimity that seemed extraordinary in a 3-year-old, and persisted into everything he did after. Harlan grew into a young person who was earnest and diligent and deeply interested in horses, which seemed to suit the land he was growing up on. Ruth grew into a person of formidable intelligence, who had already informed her parents at the age of 4 that she intended to be educated formally, which Lenora took entirely seriously, and Frederick supported entirely, and arrangements were made for proper schooling that involved a teacher from Prescott who also taught the children of several other ranch families in the area. The town of Harrow Creek changed through the 1880s as the territory changed, more people arriving, a second general store, a proper doctor, a bank that was narrow but real, a newspaper that printed twice a week and covered everything from cattle prices to the legal proceedings in Prescott with varying degrees of accuracy. The railroad had come within 40 miles to the south, and the world it carried with it was both inevitable and complex, bringing new markets for cattle and new pressures on land prices, and a general acceleration of everything that the territory had been doing slowly for the past 30 years. Lenora adapted to all of it with the practical intelligence she applied to everything. Frederick adapted with the curiosity she had always admired in him. They read the newspaper together at the breakfast table, and argued about it with the easy vigor of people whose arguments have never meant anything other than engagement and whose conclusions, even when they differed, were always arrived at honestly. The deed to the Carter land remained in the safe her father had built into the wall of the study, the original document with Lenora's name on it, preserved and legal and certain. Beside it was the consolidated deed from the Bristol transfer, and the water-sharing agreement, and the letters from the Territorial Land Commissioner confirming the outcome of the legal challenge of 1879. She had put them all in order herself, filed them herself, knew exactly what they said and what they meant. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, September of 1889, Frederick came to find her on the porch after supper. The children were inside with Margaret, who was reading to William, while Harlan and Ruth conducted some negotiation, whose terms Lenora had declined to adjudicate on the grounds that they were old enough to sort it out themselves. The evening was warm and clear, the kind of September evening that made the Arizona Territory feel like a generous place, the mountains to the north going purple in the last light and the creek audible from the porch, that constant low clear sound. Frederick sat down beside her on the top porch step, close, their shoulders touching. He had a glass of whiskey and she had a glass of cold water, and they sat together looking out at the land in the last of the light. 10 years, he said. 10 years, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Do you know what I thought about riding up here that first morning? What? I thought about what I was going to say. I had a whole speech prepared. About fair pricing and mutual benefit and my father's lawyers and all of it. He shook his head. And then you were standing there and every bit of it went out of my head, she smiled. You still managed to deliver most of the message. Not very well. No, she agreed. But you stayed for coffee, which was the important part. He laughed softly. The sound of the children inside rose briefly and then settled. Margaret's voice carried, low and even, reading something that William was clearly requesting corrections to. Lenora, Frederick said. She turned to look at him. I need you to know, he said, that this has been the most important thing I've ever done. Not the ranch, not the operation, not any of it specifically. This. He looked at her with those gray, watchful eyes that still, 10 years in, had the quality of caring about what they saw. You, this life we built. She held his gaze. She thought about everything that had led here. The morning she had stood on the porch and watched him come up the road. The months of holding her ground. The barn roof and the legal filing and the harvest social dance. And the evening by the fireplace when he had told her he was in love with her, and she had stopped pretending she was not. She thought about her father, who had taught her that land was a trust and that trust was a practice, and that a life was made of the decisions you made when it was hard. You came here to take something, she said. Yes. And instead, he said softly, I found everything. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch of the house that had been her father's and was theirs, and would be their children's and their children's children if the land was good to them, and they were good to the land. And the creek ran its low, clear note in the dark, and the stars came out one by one over the Arizona Territory, and the night settled around them full and warm and entirely real. Inside, William had got the correction he wanted, and Harlan and Ruth had apparently reached terms, and Margaret Bristol's voice came warm and steady through the window, reading words in the lamplight to the children of the two rival ranchers' families who had become, over years and over everything, simply one family, one life, one common ground. Lenora Carter Bristol held her husband's hand in the warm September dark and felt the land beneath her and the future ahead of her, and the long particular happiness of a person who has built something worth keeping and knows it and is not done yet. The creek ran on. The stars held their places. The house was full of light and life. And the deed in the safe had her name on it, the name she had been born with and kept and would carry forward, the name of a woman who had stood on her porch one morning when a man came to challenge what was hers and had, without quite meaning to, changed the course of both their lives. She had not given an inch. She had, in the end, gained everything.